then editors. How things have changed.
So you have jeggings under there, and Randy has a mankini.
What are you wearing? And you're going to do the can-can.
I'll do the can-can later on. To discuss more of this, we are joined by Bundeep Rangar, Chairman of IndusView. Plenty to talk about. Do you know, I think you've made it when you get your names combined. Do you know like Brangelina?
Absolutely, yes.
Merkozy. This is the new name. Look, Merkozy deal heightens fears. But on a more serious note, of course, it's this financial transaction tax proposal. I mean, as if they didn't upset the markets enough by not giving us anything firm to grasp onto. Now this is upsetting the market.
Yeah, like how do you go into a meeting saying we want to come out reassuring the market and completely upset it? Look, not only did they not come out with the kind of euro bond that people were expecting, or at least some call on collective European debt, a financial transaction tax is just one more message to how to make Europe less competitive in the wake of not only emerging financial centers that are alternative, but also when banks are getting hit hard anyways, and you saw the direct effect of that in the bank stocks the following day. So there's an argument that says, look, they want to fight off this debt crisis, or certainly uplift their coffers by taxing financial transactions raised between 100 and 200 billion is estimated revenue. But capital flies really fast, and the flow of capital away from financial centers where it's heavily taxed is a matter of seconds. So I don't think ultimately this is going to be a hugely popular or necessarily even positive thing for European economies, and that's a worry.
Then on the flip side, they need money. The EFSF, the fund they use to bail out economies like, for example, Ireland, that needs money. That looks pretty low right now. So analysts are equally worried about that, aren't they?
Sure, but you know, it's the old debate between wealth creation versus taxation and redistribution. And there's one thing that Obama has to look at as well in the US is that, yes, you can tax and raise more money, but where are the new jobs coming from? Where is the wealth being created?
Where's the growth coming from?
Absolutely.
Well, that brings us nicely onto this next piece. Unilever is saying now that Europe and the US face 10 years of low growth. Now, by this time, was it 2008, the credit crunch hit, the financial crisis hit. By this time, there were many predicting that interest rates would start going up because growth would come back. And now we've got massive consumer brands saying, you know what, we're forgetting the developed world, we're looking to emerging markets now. It's almost like they've given up.
And they're not the only ones, which is what the scary thing is. So look, I mean, you've got three things that are happening in favor of the emerging of the BRIC economies, or in any case, the fast-growing economies. And that, to me, is a way of looking at it. It's no longer the kind of developed versus developing. It's the fast-growing versus the slow-growing economies. It's economies in the West that are not only heavily burdened, increasing taxation, but also have an aging demographic. And you compare that with the younger populations of India, or the overall growth of the BRIC economies, which is on track to be 3 times as fast as the Western economies. Well, where would you go if you're a multinational company seeking growth?
But how much do these economies in Asia rely on big Western economies for their own growth?
That was probably more true about 10 years ago, but there's a lot of intra-Asia trade today, far more than what you saw in the past. And a country like India, which is 70% domestically focused in terms of their economy, even the world recession in the past, the 2008 crisis, for example, had a limited impact. So it's not as dependent as before. There's a lot more trade between Far East countries, for example. And I think the importance of certainly Western Europe, and to some extent the United States, is certainly less than it was before.
Yeah, we're never going to get through a day, I don't think, in coming weeks without talking about protesting. We've got 2 countries where some significant protests are going on. But let's start with Madrid, because it feels here that this issue of low growth, high unemployment, I think Spain is suffering the highest unemployment in Europe, is impacting now on the young, and they're objecting to costs of a papal visit.
Some could even argue that it impacted the young in Britain, and we saw some rioting that potentially was a consequence of economic unrest as much as anything else.
That's a debate that's going on here as well,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
But back to Spain, yes. I mean, you've got the highest unemployment rate in the EU at 21%, and a costly visit by the Pope, of which not only the people attending pay, but corporates pay, for which to get a tax break.
I mean, that's $73 million, isn't it, without security?
Absolutely, and of that, 20% is from corporate sponsorships, like Coca-Cola, Santander, Telefonica, who are sponsoring it and getting 80% of it back in the form of tax breaks. That's what I guess kind of upsets the young, where there's high unemployment. Education spending was cut down by 40 million euros by Spain last year, and then you've got this sort of subsidy. I'm not sure if it's a fair attack, but I do think it is a questionable expense at a time of austerity across Europe.
Do you think that, looking at when you mentioned the looting and the protesting in the UK, looking at Spain now, and we're going to talk about protests as well in India, do do people need much of an excuse now to protest? Do you think there's that feeling of unrest that people just need a spark, and the youth particularly will rise up?
And you've certainly seen that in the Middle East as well with the Arab Springs, right? So you've got, yes, to some extent a disgruntled youth, a hugely powerful communication mechanism in the form of social media, Facebook, Twitter, and the likes, which then creates this popular will that is expressed in the form of protest, and certainly students are part of it. Students have always been part, and the youth has always been part of change. So it's not, this phenomenon is not necessarily new. I think it's the speed at which it moves and the effect that they can have that you're seeing. And India is certainly a case in point.
Absolutely. Let's move on to this article about India, about the protests against corruption, because as you were saying, youth are involved and very much involved in this. It seems Indians from all walks of life are tired of corruption, and this being led by Anna Hazare, who now has been given permission to go back on hunger strike.
Yeah, and for India, while all the predictions there for growth, and we talked about the emerging economies, the fast-growing economies growth versus Western economies, the two things that people have always said, including another guest on the show here, who authored the BRIC report, says, look, yeah, it'll grow as long as India invests in one, education, and secondly, corporate governance. And India needs to tackle the issue of corruption because it is fairly endemic. It affects not only foreign investment, but it also affects everyday living. And when you have to get sort of grease the wheels to get school application forms in or passport applications form, it's sort of so widespread. And that's what I think people are coming up against, because the next generation is saying, look, we don't need to do it this way. We'd rather be wealthier, tax us more, pay us more, don't have, remove some of the incentives or some of the necessities, if you may, for people trying to find other means to make ends meet. There's a movie a few years ago in India called Rangar, which basically used the fight against colonialism as a metaphor for the fight against a current day evil, which is corruption. And it had a huge amount of popular student level support, and people really rallied to it. And I think this is galvanized in the form of Anna Hazare today, who's just become a symbolic man of protest with a very Gandhian-like image to him, and I think that's powerful for India. Some even call it maybe the potential Indian Springs.
Interesting times.
Interesting times. Let's have a quick word on Gorbachev, because he's finally getting his oar in, 20 years on, and having a bit of a dig at Mr. Putin.
He's obviously looking at it from the face of history and saying, time for a change and time to move on. But even when he did step down, Putin, and let Medvedev come in, he restructured the way the whole your Russian political framework worked, and while he no longer was, the front man, he certainly calls the shots from the back. I don't think he's stepping down anytime soon.
And let's talk about this final strike. Got to get this in. The Oxford Concise Dictionary has been published. We have some new words in there: cyberbullying, alternative vote. These are all new words. But interestingly, they've also talked about the new words we saw back in 1911, 100 years ago. Right. The word neon. That was a new word discovered then, and also the word a beverage, a foozy.
What was a foozy?
Well, it's slang. It's to do something clumsily or to bungle. I'm a foozy.
Do you know what? That was interesting as well. Slow cooking.
Interesting.
Slow food as opposed to fast food, and that was before fast food came out.
Interesting. I wonder the context. I want to see LOL and OMG in there. Then I know it's really
those are proper words.
See, that's a whole new argument with all this. It's youth versus the old-fashioned ones.
Like with the oldies.
Rosie, it's always a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much for going through the papers with us. There's plenty more to come from Mary and myself, though. Goodbye for now. Thank you.